Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for being here with us today to talk about a topic that we think is underappreciated and under-discussed, and that is loneliness, in particular, related to the workplace. My name is Christian Bodwin. I work for JLL, a large commercial real estate company, but please join me in welcoming Connie Noonan-Hadley.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Boy, am I glad to see all of you here. I was really thinking this was going to be the loneliest conversation to have about loneliness if no one came to this session. Do you know that there's actually an anti-loneliness meetup happening right now elsewhere at South by Southwest? So if you decide to leave halfway through to go check out that, we understand. But in the meantime, I'm so happy to be here, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Connie. By the way, is this your real photo? Is this an AI photo or is this a real one?
Oh my gosh, that is a real photo.
Okay, you look fantastic. Mine is an AI photo, and I've never worn a pocket square in my life, but it also has like 6 fingers on it, and it's been cut off. So anyway, thank you guys for joining us today. We do want to talk about something in a very serious manner, though. Loneliness is an epidemic. This century has been defined as the anti-social century. From 2000 until now, more people are spending less time with others than ever before. The Surgeon General has declared this, the World Health Organization has determined loneliness to be an official public health concern, and the US Surgeon General has declared an epidemic of loneliness impacting our people and our society. Connie, is this hyperbole, is this exaggeration, or is this real?
I think it's real. I will say that we are still learning a lot about work loneliness, and some of the statistics will vary, so there is still debate on whether how big of an epidemic it is, for example. But yes, by my measures, you think about an epidemic as something that is really dangerous, causes harm, as well as is contagious, then believe it or not, work loneliness meets that criteria. There are a lot of ill effects that I can talk about, as well as the fact that it can be contagious.
Contagious is one of the C's you've mentioned related to loneliness. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, so the 3 C's of loneliness are that, first of all, it's common. Second of all, that it's costly. And then finally, that it is contagious. So I'll walk just through each of those. In terms of its common, this is one of the things we are debating for statistics, and people have different surveys. But the one that I find fits best with my data is the recent Gallup State of the Global Workforce report that found 1 in 5 global employees report feeling lonely at work the day before. That's a really high number, thinking about 1 in 5 people surrounding you. In my own research, I just collected some new data just last month where I did a cross-sectional study of US knowledge workers, and I find about 19% of those would qualify as highly lonely, according to the metrics that we use, and others would be, another equal part would be about moderately lonely. So it's a really present phenomenon in workplaces all over the world. And then the second thing is that it's costly. And there's so many reasons why we should be addressing work loneliness, but I'll start with the bottom line. We know that when people are lonely at work, first of all, they tend to not do their best work, so productivity can take a hit. They're distracted by thoughts of rejection or not fitting in. Second of all, their actual physical health can be impacted. So if you're an employer and you're paying healthcare costs for your employees, you're going to find more doctor's visits, more therapy visits. Maybe even people have to take a leave of absence to deal with their illness. So as part of the Surgeon General's report, the World Health Organization's call to action about loneliness, they pointed out that it has a really high morbidity rate, being chronically lonely. It's worse than being obese. It's about the same as smoking 15 packs of cigarettes a day. It's related to dementia, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancer, and all sorts of other ailments and illnesses. And so that does hit corporate organizations to the degree that they are taking care of people in their health care. And then finally, people tend to leave when they're lonely at work. So you have very high turnover costs as well. So across my studies, one of the strongest variables that I find in terms of outcomes of loneliness is the intention to quit. In that same study I just mentioned, where I just collected some new data, people who were highly lonely were 40% more likely to quit than those who were not lonely. So when you think about this, there are major impacts for the bottom line. But of course, I also care about the costs, the human costs, what it's like for all those people who are out there suffering, not feeling connected in the workplace. And I think that's worth solving as well. And then finally, in terms of the contagion factor, what we've learned over time is that loneliness starts as an incident and becomes a pattern and becomes kind of a syndrome. And one of the ways that it can spread in organizations is that if you are lonely, you start to have more withdrawal and defensive behaviors that can make you a less of a great conversational and relationship partner yourself. And then that can make other people feel a bit lonely. And often this is at the unconscious level. We know a lot about behavioral mimicry and emotional contagion and how that can spread. But there was one study that found that even 3 degrees of separation, loneliness was spreading in a community, where from one person to the next person, to the next and next and next, even without direct contact with that initial lonely person, there was a higher rate of loneliness over time. So we really have a lot of reasons to address this, and there is a lot we can do, but I hope that everyone can appreciate, just from that description, that if you're one of those people in this room who's feeling lonely, you're not alone. And I'm glad you're here, because hopefully you are going to learn things that you can do to improve your situation, as well as some ideas to bring back to your own organization.
Fantastic. I'm sold. I think it's a problem. I want to talk about some root causes as well, if you're okay with that. Just at JLL, we've been doing some research on some of the causes that have led to this loneliness epidemic. There's a lot of abstract thinking on technology and others. Let's talk about some things that have changed over the last 20 or 30 years in our society. Number 1, religious participation is declining significantly. This is just one example, right? So in 1993, around 71% of Americans said they were a member of some church or a mosque or a synagogue or something. That's down around 44% now today. So it's around a 30% decline in religious participation. Now, some might say that's a good thing, and it's voodoo. Some might say it's a bad thing. This is how you achieve community. But religion is often a way that people connect with others. Just one example. Another, community engagement, we think is endangered. We asked if you were a member of a community group or a volunteer organization. Look back 30 years to 1993, around 64% of Americans said they were part of a community organization, either volunteering for like a Red Cross or a Habitat for Humanity or a social organization in their community. That plummeted around 2000. It plummeted further during COVID, now at around 17% of people saying they volunteer regularly for a community organization. It's a big dip. It's a big dip. We've gone from a country, sometimes, of community to a country of individuals. Any questions or comments on that? And I'll keep going. There's more problems.
No, keep going.
Okay, we got more problems. New York Times just ran a story recently, if you haven't seen this, and said moose and elk are endangered. And they weren't talking about the animals. They're talking about the clubs. The moose clubs, the elks clubs, the lions clubs, that sort of local, at least in my neighborhood, old men used to belong to, where you'd sort of go and just, you could have weddings there and family events. No one's a member of those anymore. Is anyone here a member of a moose or an elks or a lions or a local community club? Okay, right, 30 years ago you would have. We're also in a friendship recession. We analyzed time spent with friends, minutes per day by age group. Young people, 15 to 24, 25, used to spend about 2 to 3 hours a day with their friends. If you see what's happened kind of over the last 10 years, getting down to the last few years, it's now less than 45 minutes a day that young people are spending with their friends. Outside of a sport or a team or a school that's required, they're only spending about 45 minutes a day with other people. Older people have always had, less engagement, right? Because you think of school and young professionals, but it's plummeting. You can see now that 15-year-olds are hanging out with their friends just as much as 65-year-olds. That's a problem, we think. Any other comments on this? We got more,
Yeah,
and then we'll go to you.
You know I'm ready to talk, but you could keep going.
Now, last element of a friendship recession. We've asked people over the last 30 years again, in 1993, how many close friends do you have? How many close friends do you have individually? The average was 5. A lot of people said they had 10 or more. This is 30 years ago. 2023, the average was 2. And 20% of Americans said they have no close friends. To us, this is a problem. We think it's contributing to the loneliness epidemic that you're kind of hearing about from the Surgeon General and you're hearing about from Connie today. So what we have found is that participation in almost every organizational structure is really declining. Everything from fraternal organizations. My uncle used to be a member of this thing called the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. I imagine nobody here is a member of that right now. Veterans organizations, unions, farming organizations like 4-H clubs. Participation in every single metric is down, except for 2 categories. One is book clubs, and my mom's in like 5, so maybe she's part of that number. And then employment groups, professional groups, workplace. So we're turning back to you. The world of work seems to be the only place where people have an opportunity now or an ambition to connect.
Well, I'm glad you raised that. First of all these statistics are, they do paint the picture. When people ask me, why are people more lonely at work? I said, well, you have to look beyond work. Look what's happening in society. And these statistics really paint that picture to show. And so it does do 2 things. One, it makes people more thirsty for connection elsewhere at work, where they're spending so much of their time anyway. And it affects the way people approach each other in the workplace as well. They're not as used to interacting and building relationships across differences that you might have found when you were part of a church or you're part of a community group and so forth. So I do think there's a relationship here between what's happening outside and what's happening in workplaces. But in my work, I go beyond just those societal influences to also see how has work changed over the last 30, 40, 50 years. And one of the big factors that I focus on is the way we work has also changed. And we're going to talk about remote work, I'm sure, at some point. But I don't want to start with there. I want to start with thinking about productivity and the role of productivity in workplaces and the enablement that our new technologies and our ability to work with people around the world at 24 hours a day, how that has driven so many wonderful outcomes for companies in terms of the products and services they can produce. But it also does make you feel as a worker that that's your whole existence at work, is just to be as productive as possible, as efficient as possible. There's no, and when we talk, we'll talk a little bit of some advice that we'll give, but one of the first ones is create some slack in the workflow in order to enable more communication and connection among people. If you are just on that treadmill constantly, going from meeting to meeting or working late hours, working all weekend, it's just not going to happen. So we also have to recognize that the uber productivity world that we live in is also a contributing factor. And that applies much more at work than it does or as a reason for loneliness outside of work.
So can we talk more about the workplace? First, just to set the stage, what is the Institute for Life at Work?
Well, thank you for asking. So I started the Institute for Life at Work because what I really wanted to do was get science into the hands of people who could use it faster than you traditionally can in academia. So I'm an academic, a proud card-carrying professor, but I really wanted to make sure that we got the word out because I feel so passionately about these issues and I want to help people. And so our job is to produce things instead of just for journals that could take 2 or 3 years to publish, put it out in Harvard Business Review or the New York Times or on NPR or other forums. So that's the whole reason that I created that. And we focus on all aspects of employees' lives at work, including loneliness, but also things like team effectiveness and mental health and well-being. And then your second question, talking about what's happening and what we can do in the workplace. I first wanted to just define loneliness at work for people, and then we can talk more about the work factors that contribute to it above and beyond this productivity push. So work loneliness, and by the way, there's a specific choice of words here on work loneliness because it used to be called workplace loneliness, but then that didn't really apply to remote workers, so we're trying to get away from the workplace idea. And then others will say employee loneliness, but we have lots of gig workers and freelancers and contractors these days. So to be a little more inclusive, we're using this work loneliness term now. So work loneliness, though, is this feeling of having a distressful gap between the social relationships you're looking for at work and those that you are getting and feeling. And there are a couple parts of this I want to break down. The first thing is the distressful part. Some people will say, well, I work alone, or I'm a freelancer, or I'm an independent contractor, I'm not lonely, and that can be absolutely true. It only matters if it causes distress for you. That's really the definition of loneliness, and it's different than being socially isolated, which may not be distressful. But the other thing that I want to focus on is this subjective nature of this. So this is a strain for managers that I work with because they want to have like a loneliness detector. Like, you know, you can get scanned on your way into the office or when you log into your next Zoom, are you lonely or not? It doesn't work that way. Like, you actually have to self-report loneliness. I can't tell if you're lonely from the outside. I can't determine it based on your behavior. It's based on what I want and what I need. And that's the last thing to focus on. Some managers have said, well, you know, it's only these young millennials or now Gen Zs that are so needy and they want all these relationships, and that's just not the norm, and that's their problem. And we actually measure, each person in this room has their own level of need to belong at work. And this is a fundamental human need, but it varies in strength and type. And so you can think about like an introvert versus an extrovert, for example. They may have a different level of need to belong at work. Well, when we measure that, and we have some validated scales that do that in our studies, it is totally irrelevant to level of loneliness. And that should tell you that no matter whether you're looking to make an army of friends at work or you're looking for just one person that you can confide in that has your back, you can still be lonely. So it's not about the greatness of the need, it's about the response that you're getting in relation to that need that makes people lonely.
And you mentioned a part of that is self-reporting.
Yes.
How honest are people at self-reporting, or is there a stigma to that, or should we even try that right now?
Yeah, I mean, raise your hand in this room if you're lonely. Oh my gosh, that is the highest percentage, I think, of any group I've ever spoken to. And I'm so glad.
We warmed them up to it.
Yeah, well, we did. And I'm going to point out two things from that. One, picture me saying that same thing, but now I'm in a crowd of 300 of your colleagues at a ballroom at a company retreat, which is something I do quite a bit. Do you know how many people raise their hand? Like 2 or 3 out of 300. And you know from those statistics, there are a lot more in the room. So bravo to all of you who raised your hand in this room, because even if you're feeling lonely at work, the tendency is to keep it quiet. You don't want to raise your hand. It's very stigmatized because it's been perceived as some kind of character flaw of yours. You know, you're just not likable, or you don't have good social skills, or you're not trying hard enough. And so people don't want to admit that because, you know what, it's not easy to admit it in any social sphere, like at home or in a classroom. But at work in particular, if your livelihood, if your promotion potential is dependent on people thinking that you've got your stuff together and you're well connected, then you're definitely not going to talk about it. So that's one thing. So thank you for those of you who did go ahead and raise their hand in this room. But the second reason it's so great that you raised your hand is because that's the first step to changing it. Even if you're not actually raising your hand, if you're metaphorically raising your hand in this room, that's good. Because sometimes people don't even recognize they're lonely. It just hasn't crossed their mind yet that that's why they don't like their job. That's why they're thinking about quitting. And Sarah Wright, my colleague from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and I created a 5-question survey that we've made free and available to the public, and we're going to, I think, post a QR code at the end of this, so even you in the room or when you're watching this later, you can access it. And it's just a diagnostic that's based, again, on years and years of scientific study that will help you see, compared to the general population, are you high, moderately, or low in loneliness? And then once you know that first step of self-diagnosis, then you can start doing something about it.
It's incredibly helpful, and I think, yeah, we'll flash a QR code at the end if you're interested in taking that. I've got a theory related to this. It's unrelated to our earlier stats we showed on religion and participation, but there's also an element to me that work has become dumber. Now, on one hand, you've got people who work at maybe small firms or in a gig economy who are just like at a coffee shop typing stuff, or maybe the ideal is you're like at the beach in Bali and you're sending off a few emails and like posting something socially. That seems to be one extreme. Then there are a lot of us who work at large global corporations where work has become globalized, hyper-globalized. So you go into an office, but you're on Zoom or Teams all day anyway, talking to somebody in Charlotte or Cleveland or Shenzhen or whatever. And we hardly have any jobs anymore where you just go and there's 30 people in the same place working on the same thing. You know what I mean? When I started I used to be an engineer. I started at work in the old days, like in the 1900s. Like 1999, and you would go to work and there'd just be like 20 guys there and you would work on the same thing.
Yeah.
And then you'd go to the bar afterwards and then you'd meet friends afterwards. Now I go to work and I'm on Teams calls until like 6:30 at night, and then I dial back on at 9 o'clock because I have to talk to somebody in Singapore, and I get to go to bed. I'm like, what the hell did I just do with my day?
But how is that dumber? Like, explain the dumber comment.
It's dumber work. It's less fulfilling work. It's less real connection. You know, it's like, oh, hey, how's the weather in Boston today? Cool. Oh, cool. How's the weather in London today? Let's do 5 minutes of small talk, and then let's get on another. It's like, what am I doing with my life?
Yeah.
So maybe this is just me. I'm just venting. But I do think we have globalized work such that I don't know of almost any teams anymore. Maybe it's in tech firms. Let me know if I'm wrong here, where you can just go and just like get around a huddle room and work with 6 people and then go home. And then those 6 people kind of become your friends.
Well, I think what you are raising too is we used to be set up for success much more for relationships. We've made it very hard on ourselves. So I have another study with Mark Mortensen of INSEAD's business school in Paris, and we were looking at teams. And in fact, I'm going to go do a talk later about teamwork. And, you know, people are so thrilled by the innovations in how we do teams, where you can have agile teams or quick teams, or you can do crowdsourced teams and all these things. And they're great. You can gather as a group, do some really cool, innovative stuff, and then disperse. But the impact on the relationships is not so great, because you're not going to see these people again, or you only spent 3 weeks together. You didn't, or you were at that incredibly high throughput pace that you didn't have time to talk. So yeah, we've stripped out a lot of those things that may have seemed like fluff, but really were, I think, the glue that held organizations together. And so one of the things that we talk about in this teams-based research is you may have to create like home teams where people are placed on a team, and that continues for, I mean, it sounds like heretical now, but like maybe a whole year. You could actually be in a team for a whole year, and you could get to know those people. I have another study where we just did with a group out of Dubai, and actually they're a consulting firm, but the owner has an architecture background, and so she's very into design. And this is Marilyn Zakor from Cosmic Centaurs. And so we looked at rituals and how much rituals can be put back into the workflow in a way that does foster those kinds of connections by making it having a purpose to these rituals. And the rituals could be something simple, like even a daily stand-up could go from like a ho-hum meeting or something you just do to check the box to something that really is rich and rewarding by adding some extra elements to it to make it more meaningful. So I think we can make it less dumb by adding some smart interventions.
I hope so. A follow-up question on that, maybe controversial, is productivity, or the quest for productivity that you were mentioning in the beginning, is that almost antithetical to forming relationships? Because now so much of work seems transactional, right? And again, I don't know, maybe it's my early days or maybe it's Mad Men days. It seemed like people had time to sit around on the desk and just talk to each other for a while. Now it's like, oh, I can't, I got another call at 2:30. Sorry, I got a call at 3:30. Sorry.
Well, I think we've created this artificial dichotomy of you're either being productive or you're connecting and building relationships. So that's why I really, so 2 things. One, you can actually connect while you're doing work. So that's step 1, to keep them aligned. But second of all, you also have to think about the long game. As I talked about, when employees are lonely, their productivity will increasingly slip over time. So even if you just want to think of it as 2 separate spheres, if you're trying to achieve productivity, the way to it is through connection. But let's talk more about like what it means to not put this as an add-on. So one thing I talk about with senior leaders is, you tell me you care about connection and building relationships. How are you paying your employees to do that? And most of them are like, well, we're not. We're just paying them to do their job. And I said, okay, well, here's some things that you could think about. For example, like if you're offering a happy hour, which is a popular option, and one of our studies said that was like the number 3 option of things people wanted to connect at work. Is it always after work? So you're not paying people. I mean, technically, you're paying them to do the office or the work, but then if they take their own personal time to connect, you're not rewarding them. So maybe could you do something during the workday? Could you find a way to actually make it worth their while to attend this in some other way? But then the second way I asked, are you paying for this, is who is getting promoted, rewarded, and commended in your organization? And if you're saying this is important, and then the jerk who's not contributing at all to the social fabric of the organization is the one who gets promoted, then you're telling people, no. We say this is important, but it's really not. So I had a different study with Nancy Bain at Microsoft, and we were looking at the efforts people were making during the pandemic in fall. It was like fall of 2020, so it was still like heavy-duty pandemic time, to contribute socially to other people at work. So even things like welcoming a newcomer or offering emotional support. But we also asked about things like, hey, are you doing some kind of effort to help someone with their work if they get overwhelmed? And we found that in this study that both men and women had increased the rate of contributing that extra sort of social support to each other at work during the pandemic. I mean, people really saw the need to stick together and help each other. Women reported higher rates than men, which may not be surprising to some people. That's sort of more gender stereotypical. But then when we asked, how is your organization compensating you for these things? Like, how are you getting bonuses and promotions from doing all this extra support stuff? And men said they were significantly higher likelihood to get those rewards. And this, to take away from me here is not, oh, stop paying men for doing those things. It's maybe start paying women as much for doing those things. Because again, you have to make this part of, people are there at a job for all sorts of reasons. They want the self-esteem, they want the connection, but they also want those financial and career rewards. And so you've got to put those in place too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Happy International Women's Day. Wasn't that this weekend?
That's right.
One topic we haven't brought up, and I'm going to sound like a grouchy old man, but we haven't mentioned the T word, and that is technology related to loneliness. Again, I'm willing to own the old man 40ness, but it's got to be something related to technology, right? I see people at work who will just sit on a phone and eat a salad, like a disgusting sweet greens, and looking at their phone. And 10 years ago, that would have never happened. You would never have somebody just like eating a sad sweet green, looking at a phone. They would actually meet with somebody. They would just go talk to someone else.
Yeah.
It just seems like there's an instant draw and there's an ease to technology, and you're never putting yourself at risk to look at your phone, right? You're always putting yourself at risk to talk to somebody. You'll never get rejected by your phone, by the news app. It'll never not want to talk to you, right? Yeah. But a person could. Is that related to it at all, or should I just own it as an old man who hates phones?
So we haven't, I will say, the study of work loneliness is still relatively new. It's less than 20 years old, believe it or not, which is in academic years, like really, really young. So I haven't seen a lot of studies that looked at specifically phone use or other like non-work related technology use in an organizational environment and how that impacts. But certainly just in your description, I would say it has face validity. Yes, that would probably matter. And here's an example. So all of us here are at South by Southwest, which is, if you haven't been here and you're watching this later, at some point set your clock here. You gotta come to this thing. And I had the benefit of a good friend who has been here many, many years. And she told me, like, when you're online, because you're online a lot, as you know, to get in some of the like special screenings of TV and movie shows and music and so forth, she said, put down your phone. That's the way we do things at South by. And I have been doing that all weekend. And it really has opened up these amazing conversations with the people next to me in line. And I think the same principle should apply in the workplace as well. When you're waiting for the elevator, when you're waiting for the coffee, like, put down your phone. Just try talking to the people around you. And it does feel really strange. Like, we're so used to that, using every fraction of spare time to be catching up on our emails or checking our socials. But it really does make a difference. And I have had so many fun conversations just over the last few days here at South by from having done that.
Yeah, I love it. This is a perfect opportunity. Everyone in this room, right, everyone next to you is interesting, right? More interesting than you'd imagine, just by fact of being at this conference. Okay. On the workplace, though, there's some element. You had 7 variables or 7 factors that you discussed in your recent article, Harvard Business Review. Do you mind kind of sharing those with us? Because I think they really set the stage for a lot of this.
Sure. Well, the first thing that we are encouraging leaders and managers to do is to put this on the agenda. And as I've said, you have to kind of make it a priority first. The second thing is to start actually measuring it. And we all know data drives decisions. So start calculating what's going on in your organization. How much loneliness are we seeing among our workforce? Are there certain factors that tend to relate to it or not? So those are two important things. The next thing, as I said, is this idea of designing slack into the workflow. So carving out time, and this is incredibly difficult. But the good news is it doesn't have to be tons of time. I would rather people spend 5 minutes in a meeting dedicated to connection than wait for that moment when they have a 5-hour half-day ability to get together and do some team building stuff. It's much more important, the frequency of it, than the volume of it. The next thing that we would say is to really start thinking about how can you create a social infrastructure? Just like you do, I mean, your architecture design, like, and this crowd here at South by knows all about how important it is to design these principles into work. And we looked at in this one study with Sarah Wright is we gave a list of 8 possible things that companies were doing to build connection. So things like the 5-minute meeting chit chat, but also like having a retreat or maybe having an employee social group like a running club. And we asked them, what's happening in your workplace right now? And then we asked them separately, imagine this is happening, whether it is or not in your real organization. What would you do? How would you engage in this? Would you go at all? Would you just kind of do a limited amount? Would you participate kind of half-heartedly, or would you just like dive right in and enjoy this? And what we found here is that the bottom line of a social infrastructure strategy is that it matters a lot less what those opportunities are. You don't have to overcomplicate it with a different activity for every kind of person. The top 3 across the board of every category we looked at were the doing a communal lunch, doing meeting chit chat, and having some kind of happy hour type after hour drinks and food kind of thing. But so it doesn't have to be that complicated what's built in, like the actual elements of your design, but what matters a lot is the degree to which it's a regular routine part of the way the work is done, part of the cadence. And the groups that were not lonely in our study had 31% more of those throughout their year than those who were lonely. And I think that just tells you, again, you have to sort of build it in. It has to become the norm to do these things. And when you do build it in, you're telling people this is important enough that we're going to continually dedicate time to this. And it also allows to capture everybody, because we all know we can't go to everything. I mean, we've got other lives too, right? But this way you maybe miss this month's lunch, but you're going to make next month. So that's another thing. We also talked about how you need to really take advantage of all that remote work offers you. Most companies are hybrid, and we could maybe go back later to the return to office debate that's still raging. But if you're hybrid or if you're fully remote, there's so much you can do to build connection. You don't have to wait to that moment when you're face to face. So use the tools. There's companies, I get hit up all the time by entrepreneurs who are starting new companies trying to facilitate remote work connection. So there are lots of things you can experiment with out there. There's also a lot of like basically low-tech things, like this idea of carving 5 minutes out of a remote team meeting doesn't require anything special technologically. But don't give up on it. I feel like organizations are giving up on remote work as a conduit for connection way too soon. And then other things like we already talked a little bit about, like reward people for these things. We have to keep making sure that they're reminded and given benefit for having taken the step to help someone else, to be supportive, to make a friend, and so forth. And then the last one that I'll raise, and this gets back a little bit to the contagion issue, is that once people become lonely, they become harder to capture. So even if you have created this beautiful architecture and you have all these opportunities, you're likely to find that your loneliest employees don't show up. So remember we said in our study, we gave them options and then we asked whether they'd go or how much they would attend and enjoy and partake. Our loneliest people, you could just see in the data, most of them said they would go, but they were like a 1 on the scale versus like a 4. So that means you have to find them, invite them, make it something that they feel really welcomed at. And that does take work, especially, again, if you don't actually know who is lonely or not. But we've heard stories after story after story in our data about people who felt that they needed that one special invitation to get involved in some of those activities, and then they're so glad they did. They totally transformed their work experience. They made some friends. They felt valued and seen and heard in a way that they hadn't before. So there's like a tipping point you just have to get over with those people who are feeling more hesitant and resistant at first.
It's super helpful. You talked about two topics, though, that I want to jump back to. One was remote work versus in-office work, and then the loneliness factor there. Another was design. You found in the article I read in Harvard Business Review, there's almost no difference between loneliness of remote employees or in-office employees. You can be there 5 days a week or 0, and it didn't really change the tell us more about that.
Well, so in that study, actually, we looked at people in 4 categories. You were either 100% in the office 5 days, or you were hybrid in one of 2 forms, either mostly in the office, so like, 3 or 4 days in the office and 1 or 2 remote, or the reverse, where you were 1 or 2 days in the office and the rest remote, or you were 5 days remote. We do find that loneliness was higher among the 5 days remote people. So that is a risk factor, never seeing anybody else in person. But there was no difference among the other categories. And so what I've been trying to get the word out about is like, as we see increases of a return to office policy towards 5 days, or even if it's just 4 days, it's like, why? Like, what if from a connection standpoint, the data doesn't show that anything more than 1 or 2 days in the office makes a difference when it comes to loneliness. Now, I actually have a different study, another one with Sarah Wright, where we've had almost 12,000 people take our loneliness survey that you're going to get a chance to do yourself a little bit later. And we actually find the opposite. So right now we're finding that the people, at least in that sample, they're more lonely if they're in the office. So the bottom line, I would say here, is that it's just variable. There's no clear-cut, straight-line correlation between the number of days you spend in the office and how connected you feel. And that makes sense, right? Because before the pandemic, when most of us weren't spending as much time remote, loneliness was raging. People were very lonely in the office. In fact, when you talk about the loneliness epidemic, what people don't realize, because the Surgeon General's report came out in 2023 that declared this as a U.S. health emergency. But Vivek Murthy, this U.S. Surgeon General, the former who just stepped down, he wrote in 2017 in Harvard Business Review that this is an epidemic. And that, again, was well before we spent so much time remote working. So it's not that remote work is never a challenge for people in terms of building connection. That certainly can be the case. But it is not to the culprit here. Nor is being back in the office 5 days the answer. And the last thing I'll just say on that is, if you're a CEO and you've just declared against people's wishes in your organization that everyone must come back to the office 5 days a week, you have, by virtue of that declaration, probably increased everyone's loneliness before they even go back to the office. And the reason is because loneliness is in part this feeling of not mattering. People don't care about you. They don't care what you think. They don't care who you are. They're not paying attention to you. And every time you override the input and the wishes of your employees in a way that's very heavy-handed, that just basically says, I don't care what you want, we're going to do this anyway, you're likely to increase your loneliness. Now, that being said, there might be great reasons to be back in the office, and there might be great reasons why you can't take every employee's sentiments to heart and to build your policy around that. I'm not saying that employees should make all these decisions, but I'm saying there's a way to do it that's inclusive, where you're really listening and you're trying to collaborate on a solution, and there's a way where you dismiss people. And the latter is going to increase your connection.
And that dismissal, you're saying, increases that perception of loneliness already, right? And so I think going back to some of our earlier statistics, that seems especially powerful now, because if work and your connection at work is such an important part of your feeling, right, of connection and community, because if you're not a member of a whatever social organization or a church or a family, it could be a huge disappointment, right? It could be a huge impact on your loneliness. Okay, so a couple things I want to make sure everyone has takeaways here on this. The role of employers, what should they be doing now to help this workplace loneliness epidemic, and then we'll get into what should individuals be doing. But first, let's start with employers, since we're kind of on that track. What should that CEO be doing right now? Instead of saying, hey, get back in the office, I really don't care what you think, just get back here so I can see you. What should they be doing?
Well, the first thing I really would say is you have to start measuring. So start getting data on this. And you can do it through anonymous surveys. It's even better if you do it in interviews and focus groups. And that will capture not only the rate of loneliness and dispersion in your organization, but what people want to do about it. I mean, I'm happy to provide the questionnaire we gave people where we gave you the scenarios, like start testing out, like what would work here, what would not work here. So that's the first thing. And I find that to me, again, it's strange that organizations don't want to do this more because they are so data driven. So like get data driven about this is the first thing. And then the second thing is, I really do think you have to start not only measuring what's happening now and what people want, but start connecting your outcome measures to this. So, for example, you can look at those things like the costs that I mentioned. Look at your productivity costs. Look at your healthcare costs. Look at your absenteeism. Look at your turnover. Or do other things. Like in my studies, I look at job satisfaction. I look at burnout. And start seeing those patterns in your own organization, because that will help you set the targets. Being connected at work feels good, and there's a social reason to do it if you want to increase the well-being of humanity. But if you're a business owner and leader, then you also still want to see it improve the forecast for your own profitability. And you can do that if you start tracking these things together, put that dashboard together. So those are the two biggest things, all about metrics.
Perfect. Completely agreed. And you mentioned companies are so metrics driven on so many other things, right? Financial and technological and otherwise. And this seems to be something that they perceive as softer, right? But it can be measured.
Right.
Okay. It's not only about the employers, though. What should individuals be doing? What should employees be doing in their workplace for themselves and for others?
All right. So the first thing I would love each person to do is decide they're going to talk about this more with their coworkers. You don't have to do a poll in your next team meeting with a show of hands. You may not get the hands raised like you were able to do here. But I do think it's amazing how many people live with this as in isolation, as this is only me. And I remember, so I used to be a consultant at McKinsey, and one of my main clients was the CEO of a really large property and casualty insurance firm. And he was coming to Harvard to do a talk, and so we got together, and it was such an interesting contrast because he'd warned me ahead of time he had security. And this was before the tragic shooting of the United Healthcare CEO. And I thought, wow, you were super powerful now. And then we got into this conference room with the guard outside the door, and I said, "How are you doing? It's been a number of years since we've seen each other. Like, how are you doing?" And I said, I wonder, is your job lonely? And tears sprung in his eyes. So everyone has a possibility of being lonely at work. CEOs down to the people who, maybe are the security guard desk, people that you see on your first moment when you walk in the office. So if you talk about it, it normalizes it. And maybe you don't feel lonely now, but you want to appreciate that others might be. So you can open up that conversation referring to times when you were, or just checking in on with people, seeing how they're doing. So that's one, so talk about it. The second thing is thinking about how can you test it. And like I said, we've already talked about self-assessment, it's really important. But also sort of test out things that you try out things. So again, here, just using my own experience at South by, I signed up. Did anyone else do the 8 a.m. Noble run to tacos yesterday? So in sort of a moment of optimism, I signed up to not remembering the time change and how really cold it was going to be. But I signed up for that run, and I thought, because you know what? I'm here to try it all. I'm just here to test out new things. Let's see what happens. And I have to tell you, it was one of the most special moments of my South by experience. Because here I am with a bunch of strangers. We're all like stretching and everything. And I'm like, gosh, hope I can keep up. And as we're jogging along, I met 5 or 6 different people. We all connected afterwards. I'm now linked in with them. Very different jobs, all over the place. Things that people I wouldn't have met otherwise. So do the same kind of thing. Set your own commitment to trying out new things in the workplace. To show up to something that you normally wouldn't do. Reach out to somebody that you normally wouldn't talk to. Because you'll be surprised how responsive people are. Again, if you take this idea that it's not you, it's this whole world around us, you'll find your people faster than you think. So that's it. I would sort of talk about it and try things out, test things out would be the 2 top ones.
I love both of those. I think this is, again, South by Southwest, a perfect opportunity to try new things. And then also, your first point on talking about it, especially the further you get up the chain. This is not to make anyone here feel better about themselves, but I find that the higher someone is, to CEOs, to billionaires, the more lonely they are. There are fewer and fewer people they can talk to genuinely, more and more people who are trying to use them or get something from them. Almost no one is talking to Elon Musk, honestly, are they, right? Or Jeff Bezos. They all just kind of want something from them. And that's a very hard place for them to be. Not that you need to feel bad for them, but it's a very hard place for them to be. So you're right. Loneliness it's pervasive at every level, I find.
Absolutely. And the data says that. It's lonely at the top. We know that saying, but it's true.
Yeah, no, it's very true. I've got just one note as we're starting to wrap up here. Please take care of each other. Please take care of yourselves, especially throughout this conference. Spend some time to appreciate, as Connie's been mentioning, loneliness is everywhere. It's better if we talk about it. Any other comments you want to add as we wrap up?
No, we'll take Q&A though too, right?
Absolutely.
So people, please get some questions ready. There's a microphone at the back there that you can ask them. No, I think I would say that my goal always is to give people hope. And I do find this is the kind of thing, like we have a lot of problems to solve. And we know at South by too, there are a lot of incredible things changing and happening in front of us. It can be overwhelming. I mean, just the AI piece alone. So if you're going to pick a problem to work on, why not pick one that's actually so intrinsically rewarding for you personally, as well as for you and your organization professionally? You know, like this is the thing that we could do together that would make our lives more fun, as well as more productive.
Thank you guys so much.
All right, thank you. So yes, any questions? You can hop up to the microphone.
Can you see anything? I can't.
I know, it's really...
It's very bright.
Hello.
Hi.
I love all the ideas and all the suggestions. I was just interested whether there was any data around, you were talking about how sort of in our larger lives, the society groups are sort of not as pervasive anymore, whether it be our social groups or church groups, and then work is overtaking. And is there the case, and I wondered if there's any research about the fact that work is pervasive in so much of our life, we've stopped socializing outside of work because of that, and whether, you know, the stuff like in France where they stop employers contacting you after hours, or the 4-day work week, whether that has an impact on loneliness in a larger scale, if you have any data around that or any thoughts.
Well, I have, it's some new data that I've been looking at where I actually asked the number of hours people worked, because I'm really curious to see if there's a strong correlation between working more than 40 hours, up to 60, 80 hours a week, and how much that can make, is correlated with loneliness. I see a slight effect so far. I'm going to continue to collect data on it, so I don't know. But it does make sense what you're saying, that if not only are we doing longer hours at work, and at least in the US, that's been the case. I think France is ahead of us in trying to curtail that. But also, if it takes up so much of our mind share, that we're just exhausted when we do go home. And it does feel like a lot of effort to go out and go to that pickleball club, or, you know, go out to dinner or whatever it is with someone else. So this is another case where I'd love to see more data. I don't have it to offer to you, but you can just imagine that as the intensity of work as well as the volume of work has increased, we are seeing people less invested in the outside social life.
Connie and Christian, this was so insightful. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, I know there's a huge portion of people at South by and in general in the world who are freelancers or self-employed. And I wanted to know what your advice would be for those individuals for creating connection and community despite working alone.
It's a great question. Thank you for asking that. And yes, I do want to acknowledge that most of my work is with corporations, but we do have some studies with people who are the gig workers, the freelance workers, and other scholars have also studied this group, and it's very clear that they have a higher rate of loneliness compared to those who have an employer, and you can imagine why. In terms of advice, I'll draw upon another study I did where we looked at co-working spaces and other third spaces where people work. So I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but people always say it's like a home work from home versus a work from the office debate, but there's this whole other category of places that people can work. And if you're a freelancer, particularly if you're not doing an office type job, you probably have to be on location somewhere else. Well, I found this really fascinating. We did this study, it was mostly people in Europe, and they were using third spaces. That was how they got qualified into our study. And a lot of them were working from co-working sites. And we asked them, in which environment do you find yourself the most socially fulfilled? And it was very clear the numbers were highest for people who worked at a third space versus then office was the next one, and then home was the third. So my advice for those of you who don't have an office to go to, who don't have an organization that you're a part of, is find those third spaces. Because it was fascinating to understand, like, how is this, like, socially fulfilling? You're going to a place with people who don't work for your same organization. Like, how are you finding connection that way? And you know what? People loved it. Because what they were doing was finding that they were just like this kind of South by environment. They were networking people who they wouldn't have met ordinarily, which can be really exciting and lead to whole sorts of generative conversations and ideas and new connections. But the other thing that people were doing was they were escaping their coworkers. So like 42% of them said that one of the reasons they went to a co-working site was so they didn't have to work with the people that were in their actual organization, which is a problem for the organization to fix, I will say. But if you were a freelancer or a gig worker, just you can also translate that, be proud of the fact that you have all that liberation. You don't have to worry about all those annoying people from your organization. You're on your own. This means you can pick and choose who you work with, who you work next to, and who you interact with during the day. So start reaching out, looking for those third spaces, and then finding ways to connect with them.
Agreed. I think it's third spaces and some of those professional societies we saw mentioned kind of on that one chart, right? Even if you're a photographer locally, maybe you're independent, but you can join the Chicago Photographer Association, right? And you've at least got a network that you start to build a little peer group, and that seems to work. Yeah.
Hi, thank you guys so much for the conversation. It's super topical. I can't help but think, as we think about recent events, some occupations are inherently lonely, if you will. If I think about astronauts in space, they've been there, I think, 7 or 9 months now. How might some of your research help organizations like NASA think about missions? And then secondly, what role does meditation play in alleviating some of these effects of loneliness?
Great question. So first I would say you're right. There are occupational hazards, and some have higher hazards for loneliness than others. In my own studies, I found, for example, that people who working in knowledge work I looked at knowledge work, healthcare, education, and manufacturing work. And knowledge work was definitely the loneliest occupation. But even within that, there are different types of jobs that can be lonelier. So people who are more junior, who may be an individual contributor, for example, we see that has a correlation with loneliness. Now you're talking about people on the International Space Station, like they're really, really physically isolated as well as just organizationally. So, I think it would be similar advice to those that we were just giving for people who are freelancers. I mean, sometimes your job, even if you're part of an organization, you may basically be on your own. And so you do have to make a little bit more effort towards that. But I would also really be encouraging your organization to shoulder some of that burden. So if I were an astronaut, which I will never be, to be clear, I would be asking, NASA, what are you going to do to help facilitate our ability to stay connected with not only each other in the space station, but also all the other people at NASA and our other home people, friends, and family as well. Like, make sure that you don't take it just upon yourself to solve this, because it's impossible to do that. And so, thinking about your job, breaking it down, like, what are the risk factors here? How are these different aspects of my job likely to create some possibility for loneliness? How can I anticipate those? How can I work with my manager and with my organization to address that? I think is really important. Do you have anything else on that than NASA?
No, you're absolutely right. I think that's a particularly tough one, where technology can help, right? Where there's connectivity back to the U.S. or back to the to Earth, whereas other jobs, I think technology is actually a negative. But in that one, I think it's a good one.
And I wanted to also pick up on your second question, which was how do you think about medication and meditation and so forth. I deliberately, in my research, tend to avoid giving too many self-care type recommendations. I don't do that because I don't believe that those things can be helpful. I do that because I worry that lets employers off the hook. That being said, I am, thank you for the snaps. That being said, I do strongly think that there are ways that we can help ourselves keep mentally healthy and in a state of well-being, in a state of good connection, that would be happening outside of the workplace. Loneliness, also, just as to clarify in terms of the medication point, loneliness is not a mental health condition. It is, however, highly correlated with things like depression and anxiety that are mental health conditions. And also, conversely, if you have an existing mental health condition or a physical disability or some other kind of invisible difference, you are also more likely to be lonely because you just feel you have fewer people who understand you and you can connect with. So keep in mind it's part of this constellation of your mental health and well-being, and you're going to see some relationships there. So certainly I'm very pro medication, I'm pro therapy, I'm pro getting sleep and exercise and eating well and all those other good things that will help you keep in shape physically and mentally. In terms of meditation, what I like about that in particular is this is the kind of thing that you can bring a bit into the workplace. So I wouldn't call it a social opportunity like having a happy hour, but we do know that companies who are taking the time to invest in group-oriented wellness activities, like a meditation clinic, can actually become closer as just from having participated in that. So you get the individual benefit of calming your mind, maybe opening up yourself a little bit more to connection and keeping, not being so defensive and closed, but also you just bond by virtue of doing something like that with each other. And this is going back to my point too about integrate this into the workday. I love bonding with people doing the work. Let's just do the work maybe in a more fun way, or maybe let's take a quick break. When we first went remote when I was teaching, it was a huge shock in March 2020. We had 3 days to turn our whole program and curriculum around. And one of my students, so these were working professionals who came to their MBA program at night. And one of my students was the director of a children's theater company in Boston. So we had a really eclectic group of students in my class. And I put out the call to everybody. I said, I don't know how to run a remote class for 3 hours. I've never actually done this before, so help me out. And he said, I think we need a breathing exercise to start. And I said, you go. I don't even know how to lead a breathing exercise. So we were all, imagine 55 people on the little Brady Bunch screen here on Zoom. And he led us all standing up wherever we were, so I'm watching people's torsos. And we did this whole breathing exercise, and we rose up, we curled down, we rose up again. And it was the perfect way for us to start off those classes, bonded, centered, ready to be open to each other. And you can do that kind of thing in the workplace as well.
Amazing, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I won't make anybody do a breathing exercise right now. It's about time for us to wrap up. Any last questions? Otherwise, we just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for talking about this topic, which is sometimes untalked about. Especially thanks to Connie Noonan Hadley for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.